I wanted to do a follow-up for this Substance Painter series and have a look quickly at opacity. This was something that I got asked about and actually wasn't included in the last workflow that I did. So this is a dress I have worked on that has two kind of opaque textures, and this was built in Substance Painter in the same way that I've worked before, but it required a little bit of a different setup to make this work. So I'll show you guys now how this is done. First I'll show you the Clo files. So I have two Clo files. I had one just where she was stood like in a normal like A pose, and then I set the UVs out kind of like I did in the last videos. So if you need to go to part 1 and check that out. But I gave each fabric as much space as possible in the 3D in the UV tiles, and I scaled each material independently, so these are all the same scales, so that when we work in Substance Painter there's no change in scale. I have another one here where she's kind of in a slightly more interesting pose, and in the UV editor I have the same UV layout, so these two files have the same UVs. I also I've made the exports from these, so I exported them thin to work with in Substance Painter and exported them thick to work with in inside Blender. So the thin one is here, and this is what I will take into Substance Painter to start the texturing. So let's open Substance. So I'm just going to drag in the thin export of the dress into Substance Painter, and I'll explain setup. So the thing you need to be aware of for opacity is template. So under template we have these different options, and it should be set to PBR metallic roughness alpha blend. This will make the opacity channels work inside the preview space. If you've got it set to anything else, it's not guaranteed to work. So this is what you need for working with opacity. So make sure that your template is set to this. I'm going to set the resolution 4K, and I'm going to set the normal map format to OpenGL, and I'm going to use the workflow, and then the rest of this I can keep as it is. I'm doing a really simple setup with this. So what I've exported from Clo is also the ID maps. So I have here in an export folder, I have the ID maps to identify each fabric in the UV space. So this is identified by black and this by white. I just have two colors, so I'm going to drag these IDs into Painter and select everything and import it as a texture, and import this resource to bring it into the project because it's only relevant for this this model here, and then we'll import. So now I have the ID maps imported into Substance Painter, and I can set up a quick fabric selection in two different folders. So I'll click the folder icon on the right side here to make two folders. I'll call one lining and one lace, because I have a lace fabric that I want to work with, and I'm going to delete this paint layer. So first with lining, I'm going to right click and select add mask with color selection, drag these ID masks into this slot here, and then select pick color. So I'm gonna, these pieces here are the lining, so if I select pick color I can select black for those pieces here, and then I'll do the same for lace. So right click, add a mask with color selection, drag these ID maps over here, pick, and then pick the white color. So now these two selected, it separated the two fabrics basically. So if in the lining I add a fill and I change the base color to red, now I see that the internal pieces are all red if I look around in here. And if I choose the lace and I add a fill here and I add the base color to be blue, for example, now the outside fabric is blue. So to bake those ID maps, I just export them from Clo. So I'll show you quickly how that works. I'll just jump back to the Clo project that we had open before, and in the UV editor space, basically here each fabric is assigned its own color, so that's just how it's set in Clo. The lining is black and the external fabric is white. These colors are not important, they just need to be used to identify inside Painter. Then I click here, the second icon down with the camera on it, and I choose diffuse and normal, and then I choose a path. And if I click export, I will get the ID masks that from the diffuse channel from this one, and then from the normal maps, I'll get the seam impressions. So what I mean by that is if I click export, this will save. I've already done this, but the seam impressions are these edges here that look like seam lines. If you notice in Painter, those lines are not there. These edges are all flat and this is really smooth. There's a bit of an impression, but there's no groove, there's no relief. Whereas here, there is a very visible relief in the seam. So this is something that we've also exported as the normal map. So when we've done the export, we will have the ID maps, with the color selection. And then we will have this normal map with the information for the seam impression. So we can bring all of that into Painter as well. So that's how to work with the ID, identification here. And then with the color selection, you drag that up across and then you select your color. So now we've separated these two folders to create two separate materials. The first thing I'm going to work with is a series of textures that I have as tiles. So this is a tileable lace texture. It's kind of this gold embroidery on a tulle, for example. And I have a series of maps that I can work with for this. So I can make these available to you guys in the description to work with. But these are the channels that you need. This is what we're going to work with. So it's the normal map, opacity, roughness, metal, bump, and color. There's an ambient occlusion as well. So I'll drag these into Substance Painter. I'll select everything, choose texture, and import into project only and click import. This would be a good time to save the project. So I'll just call it dress lace. Press save. And now we can start to build the material here. So to build the lace material, we'll work with this blue material that we've set up here. And into each of these channels, we want to drag in each of these respective maps. And the one we don't need is emission. So for here, emission, I'm just going to turn this off by clicking it. And all the rest of these channels we're going to use. So base color, I'll drag into the color channel. The bump, I will drag into the height channel. The normal OpenGL will drag into the normal. I'll just check that this is the right. No, I'll take the DirectX one. There's two normal formats that I can work with, so I just want to check that the impression's going the right way. This looks correct now. I'll go back to material view. I can have a roughness, and I have a metallic. I also have then the opacity. And now, as we have got this project set up with the alpha blend, the opacity is working inside Substance Painter. We can see that here. And if I go to the opacity channel in the top, this is the opacity map that's being built for us to export eventually. So I'm going back to material view. And if you are in a project and the opacity is not working, you can correct that by going to So on the right side, there's this circle menu, this shader option, and this is the shader settings. So it's the third one down on the top right hand side. And here we have PBR metallic roughness with alpha blending as a shader that's set up. If this is anything different, you can click here and then select PBR metallic with alpha roughness. Alpha blending, this one here, just make sure you're selecting the correct shader. So if you're setting up a different project that you've already worked in, you can make that change to the shader settings here. The first thing I want to do is just modify a little bit this opacity map because it's quite intense. And the way I'll do that is to go into my lace material here. I'm going to double click this layer and call it lace because it's lace. And right click on here and add levels. And then under levels, the affected channel, I'm going to change to opacity. And on the left side of the screen, I'm going to go from material view to opacity view and just take a look closely at this map right here. So what I want is to drag up the gray value in the middle to make the white sections a bit thicker. If I go the other way, they start to disappear. And if I go up, they'll start to become a bit thicker, and then I can bring the black value down a bit to make the center of the impression completely black. This will just mean that I can see a bit more of this tool underneath. This would mean I see a lot less of it, but this would like see a little bit more. So if I go back now into material view, you can see that this is quite thick, the amount of base material that this embroidery is on top of. And if I go the other way, it starts to disappear. So this is how you can control a bit these opacity channels. And this works for all these other channels as well. So let's say I want to look at the roughness, and I'd like this to be a little bit shinier. Then I can right click again on lace, click add levels, go to affected channels, choose roughness, and bring the gray value down this time to make the internal color a bit darker. And then if I go back to material, this will, and use shift and right click to move the light, this will be a lot shinier, which we can see already. So I'm going to bring this kind of into the middle so it's not too shiny, but it's shinier than it was. For now, that's all I'm going to really look at. I'm just going to affect the tiling of this now, because this is obviously way too big to have as the scale of this material. So I'll click the lace and scroll up to the top here, and I have under the scale option tiling. So with tiling selected, you want to make sure your projection's on UV projection. This will tile everything across all the UV tiles, so this will work across both the first and the second tile, like the scaling will be affected everywhere. So I can do that by clicking in the left side and just dragging this transform slider like down to get the position of the embroidery in somewhere that I like it. So I'm going to keep going, I think a little bit more, maybe to about here, to just get a nice kind of scale on this material. This should be uniform. There's also an offset. I think what I'll do is I'll just input some values here and see how this looks. Yeah, so I'm going to go for scaling of 12, and for the offset I'll do 0.2 and 0.1, maybe a little more. Right, so now the embroidery is kind of centered in this front seam here, and we have the dress is kind of covered in this this embroidered kind of tulle fabric, basically. We can look as well here at the height map, and this is quite a lot of information on this height map right now. This is really intense, so I'm going to just reduce this intensity. So I'll choose lace on the right side. I'm going to go to the height channel, and I'm going to go to the blend option here on the right side where it says 100, and I'm just going to drop this down a little, maybe to about 50%. And then I'm going to go to the normal channel and do the same. I'm going to drop this down a little bit lower to kind of reduce the contrast of this normal map here that we're building on the left, because this is a lot of intensity. Again, I can look at just the height map for this. So if I go here and choose height, this is the height. And right now I have this this check is visible underneath because there's some opacity in this height map. And the reason for that is because we've started to blend the height channel down. So if I go here, the height's set to 50%, so it's not got anything to blend on top of. So a way that I can give this a base underneath, a base value, is to add another fill layer and drop that fill layer underneath the lace and deactivate the base color, the color channel and the emission channel, and keep the other channels open. And now you see that the height isn't necessarily as we want it right now. The way that I can fix this is to go to lace, right click, add another levels, and then affect the height channel here. And now the black value is in the middle, but if I open this black value up to the left side and bring the gray slider also kind of into the middle, there's a lot more visible on my height map right now. So that is how we can make sure that we've got a nice setup for the bump map. And then the normal map we have is looking something like this, and the combined OpenGL kind of output is looking like this. So for now, this is fine to work with to give this embroidery some dimension. I'm going to go back to material mode and take another look at this. What I want to do now is give this lining also its own material. So I'm going to go to the fill over here. I've actually downloaded a mesh fabric from Substance Online called Nylon Tricot Mesh. So this is available as a free Substance asset. So if you go to a Substance website, you can download this as a free material, and this will work inside Substance Painter. So that's what I'm working with for the inside of this dress. I'm going to delete the fill, and I'm just going to drag this material in. And right now we can start to look at the different parameters of this. I'll keep the color as this kind of purple color, maybe make it a little bit softer. And if I zoom in on the inside, we can see that there's this mesh fabric appearing on the inside as well. So this also has transparency. And I'm going to set this scaling to maybe 10 to get a really fine transparent mesh on the inside of this dress as well. So even the lining will have some transparency. And we'll see the kind of combination of colors as we look through this. The other thing I want to do quickly with the lace material select on the right side is to right click, add filter, and then under filter I'm going to go to color balance, and then under highlights, midtones, and shadows, if I open these menus down, I can just affect quickly the base color of this because it's looking gold but quite yellow. So if I bring the red channel values up, the color will become a bit warmer. And if I bring the green channels down, it should become a bit more purple almost. And the same if I bring the blue channels towards more yellow, we can get a nicer kind of color on this. So if I turn the visibility on and off here, we can see like before and after on this kind of color balance. So again, right click here, add filter, and then choose the color balance as the filter option. And now I'm going to save again the project. And the thing I want to add next is some seam thickness, because when you have a transparent fabric, we would have visible seam construction. We would see how this was put together, and we would see where these seams were to make this feel more natural. So in order to do that, I am going to add a UV border select. So we'll add a fill layer on top of this. And with this selected, I'm going to right click and choose add a black mask. And then with the black mask selected next to this, I'm going to right click and click add generator. And in the generator panel, I'm going to go down and choose UV border select, which is in the bottom row of icons here. It's called UV border distance, and it will allow us to select the edges of the pattern pieces. We will do that with the balance by bringing the balance really low down. It will start to select into the seams, and then with the distance as well, I could bring this down and up to make it thicker or thinner. I can sharpen this up in a second, but for now we can see that these are selected in this kind of white material, and that material is being controlled by this fill layer here. So I don't really want to affect the roughness, the metallic, the normal. The opacity I do want to affect, and the emission I don't want to affect. So I'm basically doing this. If I look at the opacity map now, I'm adding a block basically where the seams are, so that they are not transparent anymore, and that it feels more like a natural construction of a dress. Even around the hem, there's now like a finished edge. But to get rid of this blurred effect, I'm going to right click on the mask and click add levels, and I'm going to bring the white value up a little bit and the black value down a little bit, and it will start to sharpen up the edge of this mask and make the seam look a little bit sharper. So if I go back to materials, now we have like this. And if I go back to this layer here, if I select the fill and I push the height value up, we'll see now that the seam looks like it's being pressed up. And if I go the other way, it'll seem like it's being pressed down. So let's check that in the normal map here. So we can see that the seam impression is also now in the normal map. I'm going to go back into material in the top selection here, and I'm just going to change the color of this to a kind of golden tone like the rest of the embroidery, so it more matches that type of fabric. Right. So now we have a seam construction, we have a lining of the dress, we have the metallic embroidery has been created. If I look at the metallic map here, we could increase again how metallic this is. If I go to the lace layer, I right click, I add another levels, I choose the affected channel, go to metallic, and I bring the white slider up. Everything will now seem a little bit more metallic when we go back into material view. So this for me is a point to finish with the work we've done in Substance Painter, and take this into Blender and show you how to set up the transparency in Blender. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to show how the export process will work. So if I go to File, Export Textures, I'm going to navigate to my folder. So in my Substance Painter folder, I've created an exports folder, which is where I'm going to export these textures to. Then the output template I'm going to leave as it is. The texture set that we want is 4K, and then the template we want to ensure that we're looking at is the Blender Principle BSDF. So if I go back to settings, under output template here, drop this menu down and choose Blender Principle BSDF. Then this is a number of textures that we're going to eventually export. So if I go back to the template options, I have a base color, a normal, a metallic, a roughness, an emission, an alpha, and a displacement. The alpha is our opacity channel, so we now know that we have opacity being exported because we have this alpha. That's visible here on opacity. You see it says opacity, and then there's this pink box, which is represented by this pink box here. That means our opacity channel is being exported here. I don't need emission, so I'm just going to press the X on the emission channel and just take the base, normal, metallic, rough, alpha, and displacement. I'm going to go back to settings and click export, and all these textures are now being exported as 4K for each of the UV tiles. And what we can do now is go into Blender. So I'll open Blender, make sure I've saved this, and then come into Blender. Delete that cube, and I'm going to go to import the OBJ that we had before. So File, Import OBJ, and then I'm going to go to my folder and choose the thick. I have a posed one here, so posed thick object. I'm going to click import, and dress should import the thick one. The thick one I'm using because it's going to have a bit more detail than the thin one, especially around the edges, but in a dress with such a thin fabric that might not be noticeable. So zoom in on your dress and we can start to build the shader. So I'm going to right click on this join here in the screen and click vertical split, and split the screen so that I can build the shader on one side and look at the material on the other. To open up shader, the shader editor, click in the top section here to look at the different workspaces, and then choose shader editor. And we should have two materials selected. So if I choose the dress and I go to the material option, which is the red circle on the right side in this property panel, I choose the red circle and I have the fabric and the lining. So the first one we're going to set up is the fabric. Make sure that you've got Node Wrangler activated. To do that, go to File, no, Edit, Preferences, go to Add-ons, search for Node Wrangler. Ensure that this is selected, and then go back into the texturing workspace. Click on the green node and press Ctrl, Shift, and T to open up this texturing, this Explore window. Go to the folder where you've exported the textures and select all the textures and click Principled Texture Setup. That will open up this this node space automatically, but there is one problem that we're going to have with the UV workflow. So if I just press N with my mouse, like over here, that will close this new in and out, so that's N on the keyboard. And if I look at this in view shading here, like the shaded view of to view the shader, which is this circle in the second circle, you'll see the skirt is not correct, and that's because it's just using one UV tile and it's not using the UDIM workflow that we've worked with in Substance Painter. So this isn't unexpected. To fix this, go back to the base color channel, and we're going to work from top to bottom and just fix this one by one. So choose the folder, the white folder icon, choose base color 1, and then base color 1 should be fixed. Go to metallic, choose metallic 1, and then metallic 1 should be fixed. Go to roughness, choose roughness 1, and that should now be fixed. Do the same for normal, right here. Do then the same for alpha, which isn't affecting anything in this view right now, but I'll show you how to fix that. And then go to displacement as well and choose displacement. So now these textures are presenting correctly on this model, which is what we wanted. And I am now going to look at this to see how the transparency is working. So if I go into shaded view by clicking into render view by clicking the circle on the right side here, this will go into render view, and to look at the render engine I'm using, I go to click the property area on the right side with the back of the camera, and this is the render engine currently set to EEVE. And if I change this to cycles, we should be able to see that this transparency is working automatically. Right now the lighting is pretty bad, so we need to quickly fix that. So if I just go back to the workspace, like options here, so instead of being in 3D in shader editor, I'm going to go to 3D viewport, and I'm just going to zoom out and click on this light. We've got one light in the scene. Click the light, press G to grab it, and just move it more close to our dress. Okay, still not great, but we can see what's happening here, and the opacity is working correctly if we go back into shader editor, because this alpha is what's creating our opacity. Right now my cycles render is running on CPU and I want it to run on GPU, so to correct that, drop this menu down here and click GPU, and now cycles will be running with my graphics cards, which is what I want. So now this is running on GPU, which should render a lot quicker than it was doing on the CPU before, but this is now correctly set up the opacity. But if I go back into EEVE, you will see that this renders a lot quicker, but this opacity is not currently visible. So here we see it's just showing the base color. The other channels are working as well, it's just not using the opacity, and that can be fixed quite easily. So if you want to render in EEVE, go to the right side and choose the material icon here. Scroll down whilst you're in EEVE render view and go to settings. And under this settings menu here, you might have to drop the menu down. There's blend mode. Under blend mode, you can change from opaque to alpha hashed, alpha clip, or alpha blend, and it's up to you which one you choose. They will have slightly different effects in the render engine, but this is how you can then correctly display the blending for the opacity, and you can do the same for the shadow. So if you choose alpha clip or alpha hashed, you can control how the shadow is working as well in EEVE. So this is how to set up the opacity in EEVE. I'm just going to zoom out. I'm going to select all these nodes. I'm going to press Control and C on the keyboard a few times, and then go back up and choose lining. I'm going to delete the lining materials, and I'm going to paste in the nodes from before, and this is going to now have my lining visible as well. So this should also be have its own opacity, which is working inside EEVE because it's still set up. But no, because I'm in a new material, I need to change the blend modes again. So if I go to alpha hashed and to alpha hashed as well, that blend mode is set up as well for the lining now as well. So I can see a bit of that transparency. I'm very quickly just going to add in some lights and other details just to make this rendering look a lot better. So if I drag this scene, so if you have other Blender projects, drag them into your current Blender scene and click append. Don't click link or open, just click append. And then within this append, if you go to collection and choose the collections that you want to import into the scene you're working on now, choose the collection, click append, and then all of those things should come into this project as well. So now I've imported this collection called scene items, and in my scene items collection that I imported, I have lights, cameras, the walls, and an avatar. And I'm just going to delete the original light and the original camera that were in this scene because I don't need them. And I'm going to go back down here to the camera view, the back of the camera, to go back into cycles and just take a look at this material now that we're in cycles. So this is looking pretty nice with the lights that I've set up. This was a really easy setup. If I go in here to the 3D viewport, there's one light at the top, there's one light just in front of her here. This is an area light, this is a spotlight, and then there's one light behind her here as like to light the scene from behind to give this kind of nice lit edge. The one thing I just want to look at quickly is the shader editor here for the dress. So if I go into the fabric and press Shift and A to add a hue saturation node, I can drop that between the base color, and if I go then into hue, I can change this hue value and I can change the color of my lace. So that means if I'm not happy with the color that I made in Substance Painter, I can use this this little slider here, or I can enter a value and change the color of the embroidery based on what I want it to be. So if I want it to be this yellow color, that's this value. 0.5 is the default, and 0.2 I think is where I want to go to get this purple color. Then what I'm going to do is talk quickly through the render settings. So if we go to the right side here and I zoom, if I just take a look at the back of the camera again, I'm in cycles, I'm in GPU, and if I go to edit, preferences, and then I go to system, I want to be on optics rendering, and I want to select my NVIDIA graphics cards and unselect my CPU. Just as a setup advice here, that's how you should set up your system. So edit, preferences, system, check optics, and check your NVIDIA graphics cards. Check your running cycles and GPU, and then go down here to light paths. Drop light paths down, and you can now add in more render samples into different channels. So if you want to render more delicate transparency, like if I zoom in and we can't really see the transparency very well, I could increase this from 8 to 12, for example, and now I would render more layers of transparency. If I turn this to 1, the transparency is really not working very well. 6, it's working, but it's not as good as it could be, and it's at 8 by default. So if I move this to 10, I might get a better render on my transparency, and you can do that for the different layers that you're working with. So for volume, transmission, diffuse, you can add into those light paths here. So that's a useful thing to know for rendering the transparency. I'm going to look in my active camera of, let's go to 3. So if I click the camera icon here and then I click the camera icon in my 3D viewport, I will view through this camera now. And I want to set this to be a square render rather than a portrait render, and to do that, go to the right side of the screen and click the one that looks like a printer, and these resolutions to 1024 by 1024, and that's a 1K square. So if I click on the other cameras now on the right side here, I click the back of the camera on the other, I click the camera icon next to the camera in my property editor, I switch my camera view. So if I want to look through this camera, that's here. To zoom in a little, I can press N on the keyboard, go to view, and if I click camera to view, this will now lock the camera into how I change in the viewport here. But if I unselect this and I zoom in, my viewport space just becomes larger. So this is the angle I want to render. This is how I want to set it up. So I'm going to press N to exit this camera view. And I want to now run a quick render to start doing a quick composite to make this look even shinier than it already is. So if I press F12 on the keyboard, my render engine will start and we'll get a nice 1K render. So this is quite small, and we can easily control this inside the options we had here. This is taking a while to render and it looks kind of fine. So I'm just going to exit out of this and then we're going to set another render going in a second. So I'm going to turn off, I'm going to go back into shaded view so I'm not rendering in this space, my graphics cards aren't in use, and then go back here to the right side of the screen into the render properties. And in render properties, I'm going to go down to my render options here, turn off denoising, and I'm going to put the max samples to 2048. And then the noise threshold, I'm going to change to 0.02. And what that means is there's 2048 samples being rendered and the noise threshold is slightly higher than it was before. In the viewport render, this is set to 0.1, so it's much higher than 0.01. And this will render quicker, this will render slower. So this will be a better quality render than what we see in the viewport. But I still just wanted to increase that number very slightly to speed up the render. To change the size of the image that comes out, I'm going to go back to the one that looks like to the output properties and change this value to 200, which will now make a 2K render, so it will be 2048 by 2048. So if I now press F12 to render again, my render size is double the size, and this should render quite quickly up to the 2000 samples. 2000 is still quite a lot, it might not be needed. Like, this is looking fine if I zoom in already at 300, 400 samples. So just decide by process of test renders how many samples you need and how long you want to spend rendering your images. So I'm going to let this run to 2048, which is almost there, which is taking about 40 seconds, I think, in the end. 36 seconds to render. So now what we can do is go into the compositing space. So if I minimize this, go up here to compositing and click this use nodes checkbox, we now have our render view in this space. I'm going to click the render layer and drag this to the side and drag composite to the side to get some space to work with. Press Shift and A and search for a viewer. Drop the viewer into the right side and then connect image to image on the viewer slot. And now we will see our image in the background. If you press V on the keyboard, it will zoom out. If you press Alt and V, it will zoom in. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and then I'm going to press Shift and A, search for glare. Bring a glare node in, and I'm just going to drop that between the viewer node. So in this view space, now we'll see what glare is doing. I'm going to change this from streaks to simple star. And I'm going to change the fade, maybe put 0.6. And change the threshold to 0.8. So this will give us this kind of glisten. So look at the other options. You've got streaks, ghosts, fog glow, and simple star. And I might actually go back to streaks. To get a little bit of like this glistening effect happening on the edges of this embroidery. I'm going to then press Shift and A, search for a denoise, and drop that between. And if I zoom in quite heavily, you should be able to see what the denoise is doing. So some of these areas have kind of become a little bit blurry now, and that's because of this denoise. So if I just go straight from image into, if I drag the image output here directly into the viewer, we'll just kind of cancel out everything and you'll see this without denoise. So there is some grain happening around here, but if I drag the output of glare, you'll see this working with denoise. It makes things seem a little bit softer and it takes off that that kind of little bit of grain that's left from the render that when it wanted more samples, but we can reduce the effect of this glare and this denoise as well by creating a mix. So if I press Shift and A and search for a mix, I can drop the mix into the scene between the viewer and between the glare, and then if I bring directly from the render layer an image output and drop that into the bottom one, we can mix together two separate images and have a control for this this glare. So instead of being in mix, I'm going to go to lighten, and in the bottom you'll see the compositing just takes a second to catch up. And then if I reduce the factor of this lighten, I can kind of fade out some of this glaring that's happening. If I go really low, it will be quite a small amount of glare. And if I go all the way the other way, it'll be more glare. But to make this to work correctly, we want to make sure that the glare output is going in the bottom and that the image input is going in the top. So the direct image input should go in the top and the glare should go in the bottom. And then if I reduce the factor, the amount of glare will reduce as well. If they're going the other way, you probably will get a slightly different effect. So now it's set to 0.3, there's almost no glare happening. And if I push it to 0.8, 0.75, we'll have a little bit of the glare coming through. The last thing I want to add is if I press Shift and A and I search for an RGB curves, and I'm going to drop that in between the lighten mix and between the final output, and I'm just going to push the top end up a little bit and drag the bottom end down a little bit, just to kind of add a bit of contrast into the image. It's a little bit darker. Just waiting for the compositing to catch up here. Yeah, so this has become quite dark now, so I'm just going to move this bottom pin that I placed a little bit higher up, and then I can reduce the amount of this by dragging the factor slider down slightly. And now we've kind of added a bit more contrast into this edge. So if I now take this final output from RGB curves and drop this into composite, this is now feeding all of these this node tree into both composite and into viewer, and I go back into my render that I had before, and now my render has this glare applied on top of it. So this will then be applied to every render that I do from this point on. So if I could save this image to wherever I want, and then choose a different camera, go back into my layout space, choose a different camera, different angle, press F12 to render this. It'll take about 30 seconds to render this, and then the compositing will be applied automatically on top. So this will just render quickly up to 2048 layers, which last time took 36 seconds. So you can see your last render time here. It says last 36 seconds, the current time of this render, and the sample count that we're at the moment. So 400 and almost 500 out of 2000. And this is looking fine in terms of quality of the material, I think. And then the compositing will be laid on as soon as this is finished. So when the rendering is done, it'll say initializing execution, which is the compositing execution, and then the compositing will be applied on top. So this is how you can edit every image that gets output, or you can add some final effects on afterwards that you want to work with. But this is generally how we set up the opacity inside Substance and inside Blender as well. So I hope that answers any questions that you guys might have regarding Substance Painter and Blender when working with opacity. I'm going to make some of these texture files available for you guys to work with in your own 3D files, and let me know if there's any questions in the comment section.